March. It's all yours.
Right. Good morning. I told John last week, don't tell him that I'm teaching, so otherwise people won't zoom in. So see what happened. But no, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 8 today, if you're tracking on your Bibles. But 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we've already prayed, so I think that's outstanding. Thank you, Jody, for that. Hey, Sean, morning.
Morning, Sean.
Hey, so Samuel, as you're turning there, it's pretty obvious that Samuel is the main character of what we're doing today in our study. And a lot of people know him as a prophet, but really he was also the last judge, right? And so he was kind of this transitional figure. He was both judge and prophet, and God led Israel for 40 years through him. And he was, remember, Hannah's miracle baby, where she was barren and she prayed, and that if she had a boy, she would dedicate Samuel to God. And that's exactly what happens. He was born and she put him in service under Eli the priest. And in fact, God showed a vision to Samuel about Eli's destruction, his death, how it's going to unfold. But 1 Samuel chapter 8 is pretty familiar to us because it's the time where Israel asked for a king. But as I was reading that, I really, as I read it this time, I really noticed that there was some of these small events. It's not small, but they're huge events, but that we could kind of lose them if we're not paying attention. But there are some things that led up to the asking of the king, right? It wasn't like they just didn't ask out of the blue. There was these things that kind of triggered these trigger points that helped them to kind of go, oh man, we really need to ask for a king because this is not going to work. And so that's where we're at. So I'll read the first couple of verses we start discussing, and then I'll ask others to read it if you guys don't mind. But here we go. 1 Samuel chapter 8, first 3, verse 1 to 3. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judge over Israel. The name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second is Abijah. And they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So it's pretty natural when someone's in leadership that they want to pass on their position, especially if they care about the work, right? So this was kind of the case swirling with Samuel. He's like, man, I'm getting old. I need to pass this to the next people. And he happened to do it for his sons. So he was a judge, so he probably felt that his sons could also judge. And so it's interesting, God never appointed them. He never appointed his sons to be judges. That was mistake number one. And he never asked God for their appointment. That was mistake number two. And it's interesting because he talked with God all the time. He's one of those guys that you see him discuss with God, talk with God. He prayed and God would answer all the time, but he never brought it up to the Lord. As it seems, it never shows that he brought it up to the Lord. And so maybe he knew the answer, so he never asked, right? But that was ultimately the wrong move. And so his boys are not like him. They didn't follow the Lord. They were not honorable men. And it's pretty interesting because Eli, Samuel's mentor, had a similar issue where his boys weren't good boys. And so there's a couple of immediate lessons here, and then I'll ask you for your thoughts. But first lesson is uprightness is not passed down, right? It has to be taught. Fear of the Lord is not hereditary. It's not an automatic thing. We have to teach that. We have to show that to the next generation. But I want to turn it over to you. What do you all think so far? What do you think of Samuel appointing them as judges without God's direction? And what do you think are some things that blind us to making wise choices, wise decisions?
I think it's the way Samuel was raised. If you look at Eli had two sons. They followed in Eli's steps. So Samuel's following in Eli's steps in a sense. He's making the same mistake that Eli made, but it's the way he was raised. It's what he learned.
Yeah, it's kind of, there's a trend there, huh? Okay, yeah, thanks, Dan.
I think sometimes we think like father, like son, especially when it comes to athletes. You think, oh, Michael Jordan's kid's going to be great. But I think also parents want to give their kids the same thing, but the kids oftentimes don't have to go through what the parents did to achieve it. And so they don't have the same moral compass and same values and work ethic. And oftentimes it gets squandered. And, it's very difficult to be the same leader without the same experience.
That's a great point. That's a great point. There's particular things that shaped Samuel that didn't shape his sons, right? And to hold the same positions without the same training or shaping is kind of unwise. That's pretty good. Thank you. What else?
I was going to mention 2 points. One is it doesn't tell us why Samuel did this. And I wonder if he just didn't even think about it. If it was just like, it was just one of those decisions where it's like, oh yeah, and he just does it. And I mean, sometimes we do that too, right? And it's not because we don't know God. It's not because we don't want to follow his ways. It's just sometimes we're just like, there's this little area where it's like, we don't even think about involving him in.
Yeah.
And the second point that I wanted to make is, as you mentioned, he doesn't do this well of raising his sons. Eli doesn't do it well of raising his sons. And then the next prophet, Nathan, we don't know about his sons, but then David, he doesn't do well raising his sons either. And I think one of the things that it shows us is it's easier to be in ministry than it is to raise your sons.
No, that's absolutely true. That's amazing. You're right. And like you see a lot of amazing characters in the Bible too, where they're like, whoa, and then their sons like go astray or they don't. You're like, man, how come that stuff didn't rub off on you? You know, and so it's pretty amazing that there has to be some intentionality in the raising of kids and boys, even as you see it in the Bible.
You got to understand that Samuel was raised by Eli, and Eli treated his kids probably the same each and every way. And so Samuel didn't know any other way. He wasn't taught how to do this. And then he raised up his sons, and basically I think he followed Eli's footsteps of, that's how he raised me. That's what I know. So that's what I'm going to do.
Man,
and so if we aren't nurtured in the right way, then it's going to become, that's the way we are. Because his sons are going to probably raise their kids the same way their dad raised them.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Like, we see him be super successful in ministry, but because he didn't know how to do that, it was never modeled for him. So he just continued to do the cycle over and over, and it would have continued. That's amazing. Yeah, you're right, Sean.
I remember going to this conference for homeschoolers, and there was a speaker up there, and he was talking, and he was asking about this guy, and he's like, do you want to be great? And the guy's like, oh yeah, I want to be great. And he says, well, tell me about your dad. And he says, did he do this and this and this? And the guy's like, was he a good father? He's like, he's okay. So was your dad great? And he goes, no, my dad wasn't great. And he said, well, statistically, you're not going to be great, because we aren't, in general, sons aren't better than their fathers. Now, that's not always true. Definitely, you can be better than your father, but generally, we're not better than our father. And I think part of that is what Sean and my dad was saying, is if you're not raised up that way and you don't learn it, and we don't pass everything we learn on to our children, it's only some of what we learn.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of Jerry Falwell. I mean, I was just reading an article about his son, and his son has a similar name. His one main thing was, hey, I'm not my dad, and I'm not like my dad. I'm not religious like my dad's religious. And everybody just assumes I'm religious because my dad's religious. And I think, Samuel's sons and Eli's sons probably went about the same. Well, they were built in the same mold. They were about the same. But it's hard. It's hard to be a dad. I mean, my dad, he left when I was 14, 15. And so I didn't have any problems being a dad until my kids turned 14 or 15. Once they turned 14 or 15, I had no idea what to do.
That's amazing.
just reflecting.
Yeah, there's really something to be said about intentionality of being able to teach or pass down, and that's that for us who are fathers. That's critical. My sons are young. I need to be able to always be intentional about that, because otherwise I could just go on autopilot and think that the stuff that I have will rub off on them. Whatever good I have will rub off on them, but it's not necessarily the case, and it's you need to be more intentional. But okay, good stuff, man. Good discussion. We can keep going that way. But John, could you read verse 4 and 5 for us, please?
Sure. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations."
Okay, I have a map that I want to share. John, hopefully I can share this. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
All right, good. So this is a picture of where, in the times of the judges, where they were, but really I want to show you the tribes and how it's all broken up. And I want to show you specifically where Ramah is. So I drew this purple line here, and you can see Ramah right there. And so imagine the elders of Israel, right? It's not a Zoom call. They had to travel. It's not a conference call. They had to come together. So look at how vast and where everything is. And just the relationship of the distance where people would have been in terms of the elders of the various tribes coming together. All right, they're like, man, let's travel. All of that to say that, man, it must have been so bad. His boys must have been like, man, there's no potential in these guys. These guys are corrupt. It must have been so bad that that the elders went through all of this. They're like, man, let's get together. Let's travel all this distance. Let's come together so we can confront Samuel and ask him about this, because it's not going to go well. So this could have been like a couple of weeks ordeal, maybe even months, where they're like, man, let's get together, send some correspondence, some mail, get some messages together so we can all come together. Let's gather first. That's what the text says. They gathered first, and then they went to Samuel in Ramah. And here's an important thing too, that if the sons were good, the elders would have never asked for a king. I think that's the key thing here. And so the elders saw that, man, once Samuel died, we're going to be stuck with these dudes leading God's people, and we need to do something. All right. So I think we give the elders, I know I do, I give the elders a lot of hard time. Like in the past, when I've read this about asking for a king, and there was some worldliness about how they asked, right? Make us the king like other people or other nations. That's what we'll see a little later. But really, this is a reaction to bad leadership and potentially like devastating kind of leadership. And so they're like, man, we got to get together and think this through and confront Samuel. And so what do you think? Is this like a knee-jerk reaction? Do you think they could have done it another way? Is there an alternative that they could have pursued? What's your thoughts on this?
They could have asked for another judge.
Yeah.
In other words, let's go through the process and find us someone like Samuel and see what they could do that way. That's one thing. The other thing is they were, if you look at where Beersheba was, like you said, it was pretty far away. So there was no direct influence from Samuel on his kids. So they were just raising Cain, as we would say. And that they didn't have anybody overseeing them. There was no accountability.
Yeah.
And I think that if Samuel would have made them accountable, then it would have been maybe different.
Right. That's good. Yeah, he could have done a couple of things differently, right? That he could have stationed them closer to him so he can mentor them through the process before he left. He could have prayed about it, picked better judges. Yeah, that's good. What else?
I would say, so I'm not going to be in the majority here, I don't think, but I don't know that their request is that terrible. Just from a logistical point of view, and if you read through Judges, one of the issues with Judges is everybody just does their own thing, and when something bad happens, a judge would be raised up, and the first thing he has to do is he has to go to all these areas and unify enough people to go with him to take care of some business. And at least from a logistical point of view, if you have a king, then already he's making sure everybody's unified. Already people don't get to just do their own thing because there's somebody who's in authority over them. And so I look at it and I'm like, I kind of understand where they're coming from. I understand that, hey, they've got these leaders here that they're like, man, these guys are corrupt and we need somebody to be in authority over them. Now, there's definitely a flaw in all of this logic, which is you have to have a good king, and it's not hard to get a really bad king. But I do, at least from a standpoint of the tribes are all divided. You showed that map, and there's all these areas, and they're almost like their own little kingdom, and how that's kind of hard to manage.
Now, the more I read this, the more I realize, yeah, that's them asking for a king. Like, I can't be so mad at them. That was one of my takeaways too. But good point.
It's interesting to me that they're called apart to not be like everybody else. And yet they're saying, hey, we want to be like everybody else.
Mm.
They're called by God to be God's chosen people. But they're looking at, well, this is how the world solved this problem. So this is how we want to solve this problem.
And I think that's a good point. But I think, and to be fair, when in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and all of those, God sets up a pretty robust system of government for them. He's got the cities of refuge and all of these things with the Levites kind of overseeing a lot of things, and it's pretty cool. But my impression is that they're also not necessarily doing their job, and so they're seeing this other form of government out there, and they're like, but I see that it works over there. Can't we have something that works over here?
And also, if the, you got to look at it as basically they have 12 co-leaders. I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you have co-leaders. It is horrible because nobody makes a decision, or 5 people agree and the other won't. And it's just, it's leading by compromise, because that's how you get anything done, is by compromise. So that's one of the things that they didn't have. The other thing they didn't have is an army. Every time they were attacked, everybody would have to send their people together and then go. Where with the king, they would have an army. And he, God spells it out later on. Well, if you're going to have him taking your sons, he's going to, take your food. He's going to do all these things. But they didn't realize that. But they see that this co-leadership isn't working.
Yeah. There's a lot of factors. You're right. And Samuel has been doing a good job for 40 years. And, part of it is that, man, he's such a good guy, and you're like, and he's going to go away and we're going to be stuck like Chuck, and we don't know. So he's not going to have a good judge. Let's have a king. Yeah, it's working for other nations. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. In education, we have a revolving door with principals, and you get a bad principal, it can get really bad really fast, and you're looking and searching for anything. You're like, just get the guy out, and you're just like, anyone but this individual, because they can make it so horrible. So I can definitely feel their desperation. Unfortunately, when you're desperate, you're not really thinking.
Yeah. And
so you'll take anything because it's better than the alternative, just to get to the other side for your comfort. So I definitely sympathize and totally understand where they're coming from. And yeah.
Good point. Yeah, they're like, man, they're scrambling, right? And they make it a point. They said, you're old, and your sons don't walk in your ways. It's just a matter of time. We got to fix this. And there could have been a way that they approached it. I think I don't think it was Sean who said, hey, they could have asked for another judge. They could have done a couple of different things, but they're like, nah, I don't know, man. Let's scramble. We got to do something, right? Because we can't be stuck with these dudes, these knuckleheads. Yeah, it's good. Okay. Mark, are you good to read? Are you able to read?
Can I point out one other thing real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this just came to me, so I apologize. I haven't thought it out. It might be totally wrong. But one thing that's interesting about having a king in this time, if you have a king that you don't like and you want to get rid of him, you rebel against your king. And I just think that's interesting, because the way that they're setting up their government is, if we don't like it, the only way to fix it is to rebel against it. And that can be a problem, particularly for God, who's overseeing all of Israel. And he's like, okay, so if you want to change things, your only plan is full out military rebellion. That might not be the best approach for setting up a government to change it if you need to change it.
Yeah, you're right. Good point. Hey, Mark, would you mind reading verses 6 and 7, please? 6 and 7.
Yes, sir. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you.
All right, thanks. I love how Samuel responds, right? His immediate response in verse 6 is, so Samuel prayed to the Lord. So as he's listening, he doesn't lash out. He's not arguing right away. He doesn't do anything. His immediate response was to pray to the Lord. And it's pretty cool. It reminds me of Hezekiah when he gets the letter from Sennacherib, and he's like, man, his first immediate response is to spread it before the Lord and kind of bring it to God. And I love the heart and how this man is shaped in terms of responding to trouble, right? Bring it to God right away. And so it's curious to me, that still makes me more curious to go, why didn't he pray for his boys, right? He's so conditioned and so rightly shaped to respond with prayer all the time why didn't he do that? I don't know, maybe he did. I'm not sure, right? It doesn't say. But verse 7 says, I love how God speaks tenderly to Samuel, right? And he says, because he knows what he's feeling. He says, they haven't rejected you, they rejected me, right? Don't take it personal, Samuel. Like it's you're my representative, and they're not rejecting your leadership, they're rejecting my leadership. And God elaborates. He elaborates his past deeds that he's done for them, and specifically he points out Egypt. So you can think about all the miracles and the plagues and in the Red Sea, and how he provided for them in the wilderness for 40 years and settling them in the promised land. And God could have listed more, a whole bunch more. Jericho, the patriarchs, right? Gideon, all those different things, but he just kind of focuses on Egypt for now. And God says, no, they rejected me and all of that. They didn't reject you necessarily. But something else here in verse 8, he's actually identifying with Samuel. He's saying, what they're doing to me, they're doing to you, right? They're going to do to you. And so it reminds me of John 15, verse 20 says, what Jesus says, remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. So inevitably, this is the reality of faithful ministry, right? That as God is being treated, so is his servants. And so, what do you think so far? What do you think of God's tenderness to Samuel? What do you think of God's tone here, where it feels almost brokenhearted? You can see a little bit of the grieving there. But what's your thoughts about this section?
I love it, because God immediately responds, and he responds with, it's on me, I got you.
Yeah.
and he gives clarity and context and understanding. And he's coming from Samuel's perspective. He's like, dude, don't worry. It's really being directed to me, so that Samuel, when he receives it from them, he can respond in a godly way.
Right.
So that he has clarity, because God's already given him an answer. Now, when they come to him, he can respond with the word of God, because God has already answered him and told him the direction ahead. I mean, you can only imagine if he were to go to the leaders prior to hearing from God and then getting this brunt force, taking it, maybe he lashes out, maybe he goes a little irrational, or, maybe he goes up and down, this, that, and other. By going to God first, God providing that clarity and context, and then taking on that as well, taking on that responsibility. God's like, hey, I got you. I'm taking care of that, which is characteristic of God, right? Always looking for our best interest, and showing us the way, and then allowing Samuel to walk out what he needs to be walked out. So I'm inspired by that. Again, it shows me the heart of Christ, and his willingness to sacrifice for us and to take on the burden. But we still do have to walk through the walk, right? We still got to go execute the plan, but taking on that huge responsibility and taking that contact, and then being able to shoulder the burden, that responsibility for us is huge, so that we can actually walk through what he's calling us to walk through. I'm really appreciative of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
They were physically, or they were spiritually giving God up as their king. That is their king, is God. And they didn't have all those countries that were surrounded them had physical rulers, and God was a spiritual ruler. And they wanted a physical ruler instead of a spiritual ruler.
So I was gonna say something kind of similar to that, but a little bit different, Jody, which is he even gives them that. And that's not what they want. And what I mean by that is when he says they've rejected me, I'm reminded of the future of Jesus. And even here, they're going to get some bad kings, and they're going to get some prophecy of, hey, I'm going to send this guy, the Messiah, the anointed one. He's going to be your king. And they're just like, all right, we're waiting for that Messiah. He's going to be a great king. And he comes. And not only does he come, but they actually recognize that he's the Messiah. They have that day where he's riding the colt coming in, and they're putting down the bronze, and they're like, this is the Messiah. And then they go and have him crucified, and it's like so God is even saying, I'll give you a king, and you want a physical king, I'll even give you a physical king who has authority over heaven. And that's still not, you're still going to reject them.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I think of myself, if I was Samuel, probably the first thing I would have done is turn to God and say, would you just wipe all these guys out? Let's start over again.
Yeah. What we need are actually new elders. What do you think of that? Yeah, that's good.
I mean, if you've been around me enough, you'll hear me say it. Just got to fire them. That's what I would have been. Okay, God, you just got to fire these guys. Let's get some new ones.
That's it.
And when you fire people, you're allowed to use real fire. So
all you got to do is fire a couple of them, right? Everybody
That's
will
right.
understand. Oh, that's good. All right, we got a big chunk in the next one, 9 to 18. Sean, are you okay reading 9 to 18?
Sure.
Okay.
Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. So Samuel spoke to all the words that the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. And he said, this will be the procedure of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and reap his harvest and make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. And he will take a tenth of your seed of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourself will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day.
Thanks, Sean. So God tells Samuel, hey, tell him this, right? Tell him this thing that manage their expectations. This is what's about to happen if they continue to ask for a king. But it's interesting to me, whenever I see warnings like this, what I tend to see is that it's really a demonstration of grace, right? It's a demonstration of kindness whenever you get a warning. Like if you're in a zoo and there's a little placard or something that says, don't touch the animal, it's dangerous. That's being kind to you, because otherwise you would have touched it. Or maybe there's a wire that's electrified and it says, don't touch the wire, it's gonna electrocute you. The warning is actually a demonstration of kindness and responsibility and grace. And so God could have been totally bitter here. He could have been vindictive, and he could have said, well, be careful what you wish for, or you made the bed, now lie in it. It would have saved us 9 verses, right? But and he would have been totally justified with that. But more than anything, what I think even in here, what we see is God's heart, right? His steadfast love for them, his patience for them, his kindness to them, where he's like, I'm telling you what you're asking for this. You have no idea what you're asking, but this is what comes with having a king. And it could have been still an opportunity for them to go, you know what, let's just stay with the model that God has. I'm sorry for asking for a king. But later we'll see that they persist with it. But I love the picture that God goes, hey, look, all this truth comes with what you're asking, because you don't know what you're asking. And so, how do you react to this? How when we read this, what shows us about God? Like, how do we see God clearly through this? And what else do you see in terms of giving us a warning about stuff we ask for?
So one of the things that I think is interesting about warnings is sometimes you see a warning and you think, wow, that is dumb. I don't need that warning. It's kind of obvious, but apparently we do need them. And so when God gives a warning like this, not only is it mercy, but it's also to make sure that everyone is completely aware. And they may even hear this and they're like, well, yeah, I know that's obvious, but he's still like, no, think about it, take a minute, take a beat. And I would point out, it's kind of a funny story. I have a picture of a warning that I think is hilarious. I went to the Grand Canyon, and when I went to the Grand Canyon, I had to use the bathroom, and I went in there and I opened it up and I go into the stall, and right above the toilet is a warning that says, don't drink the water. And I'm like, do we really need that warning? But apparently
someone drank it.
We need some warnings. And I just think, sometimes you might get a warning and you're like, do I really need it? But God's saying, yes, I'm sorry, you really need it.
Yeah. It's true, right? And someone said that, whenever there's a warning or something that is telling you that, it's possibly because someone did it already. And now you're just trying to be careful for the next batch. Yeah, good. What else? What do y'all think of this? Where God says, man, this is the list of things that comes with this package if you're asking for this.
Well, verse 18 caught my attention. It was the Lord will not answer in that day at the time of their king. So he's basically telling them, you're on your own with this guy. I'm not available to you anymore.
Wow.
Is he saying that? I mean, or I'm not disputing it, Jody. I'm just wondering if it's like he's saying, here's the warning, and when this happens, don't come crying to me that it happened, because this is guaranteed to happen. And maybe I'm misreading it, and maybe it's God saying, you're going so far away from me that I'm not even going to respond. But I wonder also if it's part of it is just like, yeah, I told you it's going to happen. I'm not going to do anything about it because that's what's going to happen.
Right.
What's happened is this king is going to raise the misery index.
I'd never heard it put that way, Jody.
Yeah, that's the
I love
misery
that.
index is going to, and he's not going to come to their rescue, is what he's saying.
All I'm saying is I'm going to use that from now on, Jody. The misery index. That's
And the
That
other-
is well said.
The other thing is that God still has a plan, because he goes around Saul's back and raises up David. And of course, we know all the story of David being chased by Saul for all those years, but Samuel still has another job, which is being judged to raise up the next king after Saul. And so it's not like God's giving up on them. He's just saying, this is what's going to happen to you, but I got your back. I'm gonna bring in a real king, one that is a king after my own heart.
Yeah.
And piggyback on, oh, sorry.
Go for it.
No, just to kind of piggyback on that he has a plan, and the piggyback on Sean's plan is very similar to Israel currently right now, right? It's like, you're on hold, and there's a plan for you to be grafted in and towards the end, right? That they're not accepting their Messiah right now, but we know in the end that they will accept the Messiah, and God has a plan for that. And so God has a plan for everything. And I just, before Sean said something, I was just looking at the level of detail that God places on everything. Like he catches everything. He's like, look, I'm not even going to give you a superficial preview of what. No, I'm going to tell you in very great graphic detail of exactly what's going to happen. He's going to take pillage. I mean, he's going to he is every single area. He doesn't cut it short. He doesn't make it simple. He goes very detailed. And what will the king actually do? And so it's kind of like you're at the point you're without excuse, And there's so many opportunities to be like, yeah, you know what? I don't want you taking my daughter. Maybe that's the one that's going to hit me to where I'm like, nah, I'm gonna go in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Or my crops. Yeah, he could take everything else with my crops. Can we think about this? Like, it's like all these little points and opportunities. But we are human beings. Oh man, we're human beings, and at the end of the day, we're hopeless without him, man.
Yeah.
So it kind of comes back to that point. He can put up every warning possible, man. And it's just, we fall in that trap, and I'm so grateful for his mercy.
Yeah. And we can bring this home to our lives too, right? When we go, man, there are warnings for things that we do when we run away, when we are kind of wayward. There's enough warnings for us. And God is gracious. He's still great. He's gracious in the warning, and he's gracious even in the repentance to bring us back, right? It's kind of amazing to see this picture of God's heart, right? As he goes, man, this is what's going to happen when you disobey. But then there's also what we'll see later is that, continually God responds with kindness. It's amazing. But he judges, but you know what I mean? You see the kindness of his heart. All right, let's keep going. Jody, you think you're able to read 9 to 22 is the last section?
19 to 20. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us. We also may be like all the other nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, after Samuel had heard all of the words of the people, he repeated to them in the Lord's hearing. The Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice, and appoint them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city.
Right. So it's amazing. Their request is to be able to say a king that's going to judge for us and fight our battles. God's done that historically for them, right? But they're asking it so they could, because they're probably they're desperate, they're seeing what's going to happen with these knuckleheads. So they're like, man, we need somebody to judge and go before us in battle. But verse 22, God says, heed their voice. In other words, give them what they're asking for. And I think, I don't want us to get it wrong, right? God's not stuck, right? He's not going, oh man, you guys are, I don't have any other choice. But I would love to think that, God could have, if he wanted to, said, no way, request denied, I'm ruling over you. And, he could have done that. But I think it's amazing that he says, instead, he chooses to go, hey, give them what they're asking for. I've warned them. I've given them the details. They're asking for it. And in this point, God chooses to say, give them what they're asking for. And it kind of reminds me of Jesus, Matthew 23, verse 37, when Jesus looks over the city and says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophet and stone those who are sent to you, how often I long to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you are not willing. And it's amazing to me that there's this massive rejection of God and his prophet, but God continues to be with them. That's what we'll see, right? Even through the bad kings, God continues to be with them. He continues to fulfill his promise to them. He continues to kind of be faithful to them, even though they're faithless. And eventually we'll see the kingdom split. The northern kingdom is going to be conquered by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom is going to be attacked by Babylonians. A few people are going to be taken. Remnants going to be taken into Babylon. But even there, God is faithful through the exile, and eventually to bring them home, and eventually to bring the Messiah. But it's amazing that God chooses to go, all right, you're asking for it, you can have it, but at the same time he remains faithful. So the question is, how does that have you ever seen that in your life, where you're like, man, I'm going to push this, I'm going to push it because I really want it, and God's like, all right, and then you see God's continual faithfulness, still like an undeserved faithfulness that he displays to us. What do y'all think so far, this last section?
Yeah, I think God does that with all of us at one time or another. And when I was a teenager, I wanted to be on my own. And my mom finally just said, okay, you can be on your own. And I suffered the consequences of it. But I was on my own. I grew out of it. But, then when our kids get older, they want to be on their own. And so, okay, you want to be on your own. All right. But don't come running back to me to bail you out when you get into a jam. And I think God's saying the same thing to the children of Israel and saying, okay, you can have a king, but don't come running back to me when the king doesn't work out.
Yeah.
But we all go through that.
I think,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, March.
No, I had nothing important to say. Go ahead, John.
I think that, I mean, and this is true. And there are times we ask for him and ask him and he push it and he's like, okay, I'm going to give it. And there's warnings. But I think there's also times we ask and he's like, yeah, I can work that out. We'll work it out. And so it's not necessarily always a bad thing. And it's not like we're pushing. I liked what you said earlier. God has options. You're not pushing him into a corner. Even if he approves your request, you didn't push him into a corner to approve your request. He can still work with it. He can still have a plan with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. God's not like, I'm stuck. Oh man, you guys did it. You guys did it to me. Yeah.
Well, and I like that because if you have faith of the mustard seed, right? God doesn't need much to do something. He just needs a little, and whatever that little is, he can do with it whatever he would like to do. They say God never loses a battle, but he never wastes a battle. And so I think that's one of the illustrations here is like, we have the privilege of looking at it now as a Monday quarterback and allowing us to be strengthened and encouraged and see and know God's faithfulness. And I think that's one of the things that I can find from here is that in spite of, you know, our ways or my own ways, that God is still faithful. He will always be who he is in spite of what we're doing, and he has a plan. And so, you know, I can continue to walk in the way that he wants us to walk and trust him through the process of all the things that go on in our lives and currently going on in the world, as we see in Russia and Ukraine, you know, that God has a plan for that too, you know? And so, yeah.
No, I love that. And even when we see, you know, what we see is even when our faith is not there, right? When the disciples were in the boat and the storm was there, Jesus specifically says, have you still no faith? And you're like, and he acted even if they weren't demonstrating faith. So it's kind of interesting that God, you know, does that, and he's not, you know, he's not like the principle with Freddy Krueger, right? Like where you're like, if you're frightened and if you're fearful, then he gets stronger, right? Or the same thing where in our faith, where God's like, oh no, you didn't believe me, I'm stuck, right? But God's like, no, I'll act if I need to, and then when I want to, for my glory, for my name's sake. That's cool.
One of the things I want to kind of put in there is God doesn't have options. He has his plan, and he knows what we're going to do even before we do it. So he knew that these guys were going to come. He knew the sons were going to be rebellious. He knew all of this stuff, but he let it happen. And that's really how it is. It's not like, oh, they want this, so okay, we're going to go to plan B. Well, God doesn't have a plan B. He's got a plan A, and all things work to the good for those who believe. And that's really what it comes down to is, even though we make mistakes and we do things wrong, God knows it, and he has that plan for our life. And it may be a struggle for us because of our choices we make, which is what happened to Israel, but he has a plan, and that's going to happen.
That's really cool, Sean. And one of the aspects of that is we have influence on that plan too. And it's kind of weird. How does it work where we're temporal and he's not temporal, but we can ask things and he's like, yeah, we'll get, that's part of the plan. And so we have influence on it, and yet he knew it all in advance. It's really interesting. I like that.
No, I love
Sorry,
that.
Jody, I didn't mean to step on top of you.
Yeah,
there.
go for it, Jody.
Hey, verse 20 applies to today, because the end of verse 20, it says that they went the king to do their battles, and they rejected God to fight their battles. And we're supposed to depend on God for everything to lead us in today. And here they're out and out rejecting God's sovereignty to protect them. They want this king to do it. This guy that somehow, this guy's gonna somehow replace God.
Yeah, right. And they're asking for something that God's already doing for them historically, right? So go ahead.
Sorry, I was just looking at that same verse, and I had this thought earlier, but one of the crazy things is it says they would prefer a king to judge, like for them, like as if the judge is as if he's going to be just, right? Like he's not going to be slightly like, oh well, I kind of need that for myself, as Saul did. I mean, not Saul did. Yeah, as Saul did. No, Ahab. With the vineyard, it's kind of like, oh, I kind of need that vineyard. Let's just kill that dude so we can take the vineyard, et cetera. But just the idea, the thought that this king will come in and be a righteous judge, as opposed to God being a righteous judge. I just thought about that when I saw that. I'm like, again, it come back to who we are and why we need a redeemer. But I was just like, man, I would prefer God to be the judge. I know that when he judges, it's the right response, answer, etc. Like it's good. It's
Yeah.
perfect. I might not like it. It might suck. But I know that it is perfect. And with a king, I don't know what, he might have had too much to drink last night or whatever the case may be, or, his wife might, be gone, I don't know, so his mood, nonetheless, I just thought about that. Sorry.
No, I love that. But it goes back to what you said earlier with your principal kind of analogy. Like they're desperate. They're like, man, I don't know. Like we're just not thinking. We're not looking it through. We're not looking at historically. We're trying to pull a rabbit out of our hat right now. Yeah.
What I think is interesting about this is that's what they want, but that's not actually what God gives them. He gives them a king, he gives them a judge, but he never stops fighting for them. He never stops fighting their battles for them. And we even have this, there's this cool prophecy in Ezekiel that I think we might be getting close to, but the whole thing is their government, they can't protect themselves, and God makes it clear that he's the one who's fighting their battles for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I was going to close with those two ideas that we're kind of, we kind of mourn with the if only situations, right? If only his sons were good, if only Samuel talked to God before the judges, if only the elders didn't ask for a king. But what we see are two things. We see that God's not stuck. I like what Sean said. He's not stuck in a corner. He's not stuck with no options, right? He's persevering through, with what he had planned to do. But also the second thing is that God knows how to restore, he knows how to redeem, and he knows how to rebuild. And so even through, the wreck that we kind of create in our choices, God is able to redeem those when we continually submit to him. So in them, there's going to be pockets of submission to God, and God's going to honor that. Certainly not for the northern kingdom eventually, where they get decimated by the Assyrians. But what we see is God still remains with them, and he's still patient with them. Right. So as we got 1 minute, so I just want to see if there's any closing thoughts, takeaways, lessons learned.
I just wonder what happened to Samuel's voice. I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us, but here's two guys that are in the position to be the judges, and they're in authority, and they're corrupt and they're no good, but they're in that position, and then they just disappear. You don't hear anything about them anymore.
Yeah, good point. What do you say? Hey, Mark, you're muted. What'd you say?
Oh, I was just joking. I was like, that's probably a good thing that they didn't elaborate on what exactly happened to them. Maybe nothing, but maybe something. I don't know.